Hey, everybody. Hello. Hi there. Good evening. Hello. Nice to see all of you. Hopefully you're somewhat dry. My name's Rabbi Aaron Potek. I'm the Senior Rabbi and Executive Director here at 6& And on behalf of 6& and our partner, The Atlantic, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you who are here in person, as well as those of you who are joining us online this evening. For anyone who is here for the first time, 6& is a nonprofit center for arts, entertainment, ideas, and Jewish life. And by attending our programs, you help fuel our mission to inspire more meaningful and fulfilling lives. So thank you for being here. A round of applause for yourselves. We are very excited to welcome back Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson to speak about their new book, Abundance. Ezra is an opinion columnist and host of the Ezra Klein Show podcast at the New York Times. He's the author of the bestseller, Why We're Polarized, which was one of President Obama's top books in 2022. Not too shabby. Derek Thompson is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the host of the podcast Plain English. He's also the author of the bestsellers Hip Makers and On Work, an anthology of his writing on labor and technology. Across their reporting, I appreciate how both Ezra and Derek consistently lean into hard conversations and aren't afraid of differing opinions. Their work is rooted in integrity and sometimes painful truths, and it expands my thinking in nuanced and challenging ways. Their new book, Abundance, is a call to rethink big and entrenched problems that seem mired in systemic scarcity, from climate change and housing to education, transportation, and healthcare. Put simply, they say that to have the future that we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. They make the case for an abundance agenda which uplifts the world we could have, the world we deserve. At a time when movements of scarcity are gaining power around the world, Ezra and Derek propose an answer that meets the challenges of the moment while also grappling honestly with the fury so many of us feel. Amidst the gutting of the federal agencies around here that support fundamental aspects of our lives, this conversation could not come at a more necessary time. Tonight's program will be moderated by Jerusalem Demsas, a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she writes about the housing crisis and local democracy. Her reporting spans issues from infrastructure, labor economics, and federalism to race, gender, mobility, and the politics of exclusion. Jerusalem hosts The Atlantic's flagship policy podcast, Good on Paper, and is the author of On the Housing Crisis, and we have autographed copies of that available for sale. Thank you again, everyone, for being here this evening and for joining us virtually. Please help me give Ezra, Derek, and Jerusalem a warm 6& welcome.
All right, what's up, DC? All right, this is going to be a fun night. We've done 2,000 interviews and a number of live events, and they've started to get all the same. So we're going to switch it up tonight. Tonight is for the haters. Tonight is for the critics, the people who don't get us. The short-sighted. The book has been out for a couple days, and we have gotten a bunch of actually really good and interesting critiques. Books are, if you do it right, generative. And one thing they generate is people telling you why we're wrong. So we've asked our dear friend Jerusalem, who is an inspiration for much of the book, to collate, both from you and from what's out there in the ether, some good critiques, some good, like, why we're wrongs. And we'll try to give it an answer. So we're looking forward to it, and we are grateful to Jerusalem for speaking for the critics.
Yes, I love to be known for hating, so this is a good night for me. So I have a lot of questions that folks here on the live stream have submitted. I will call out the name when I am tagging your questions, so listen carefully. Shout out even if you want. So Before we get started, though, despite the fact that every reviewer and person on Twitter seems to have read your book in like 5 days, it's possible that people in this audience have not read the book yet. So Derek, can you start us off? What is Abundance about? What are we looking for here?
So we're about to dive into the muck, as Ezra said. We're going to get down and dirty with the critics. So I actually want to begin in the opposite. I want to start with like the loftiest possible vision for this project before we basically spend the next 58 minutes and 13 seconds tearing it apart, right? So there's this concept that I'm really, really interested in that Ezra introduced me to from the University of Cambridge historian Gary Gerstle called the political order. And a political order is Gerstle's idea that the way America moves forward is not how the parties disagree on a week-by-week basis. It's not the thrum that exists in headlines and tweets. What actually moves history forward are the subtle ways that the parties agree. And in the last 100 years, Gerstle says, there's been 2 different political orders that have defined the American project. The first political order came about in the 1930s and ended around the 1960s, 1970s, and that was the New Deal order. And every political order is defined by both an internal crisis and an external threat. So the New Deal order was defined by the internal crisis of the Great Depression and defined by the external threat of the global specter of communism and socialism that FDR had to find an American answer for. And so his answer, the New Deal order, essentially said, in order to solve the most important problems in America, we need a new conception of the relationship between the state and the people. We need a muscular government and new agencies. We need to build. And they did. They built roads, they built the Tennessee Valley Authority, they built bridges, they built highways, they built and built and built throughout the 1950s and 1960s. But around the 1960s...
And built social insurance.
And built social insurance, yes. Exactly. And really important that they didn't just build stuff that existed in atoms, they also built Social Security and the Great Society and Medicare and Medicaid. And one way that you know that a political order is real is that it is agreed to, it is acquiesced to by the opposite party. So Dwight Eisenhower was not a Democrat when he came into office in the 1950s, but in many ways he acquiesced to the New Deal order by saying, I actually want to expand social welfare. I want to continue the building project with the interstate highway system. Dwight Eisenhower was much more of an FDR Democrat than he was a Ronald Reagan Republican. But around the 1960s, 1970s, the New Deal order broke down. And it broke down for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, you had stagflation, the combination of stagnant economies and inflation, which was a problem that the Great Society didn't know how to solve. And at the same time, you had Vietnam and the rise of the Soviet Union, which was a new threat, a new external threat to define the American project. And so what you saw in the 1960s and 1970s was the New Deal order fall apart. You saw the rise instead of a new kind of individualism. You saw it on the left with the rise of the New Left and the beatniks, and you saw it on the right with the rise of libertarian economics. And for the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've been defined by this new political order of what Gerstle calls neoliberalism. This idea that we need to make it actually harder for the state to be muscular and active. We can find new ways of allowing individuals to sue to stop the state from, say, building a house or building a transmission line or adding solar or adding some new piece of infrastructure to the landscape. We made it much harder to change the physical world. And what we think is happening right now is in the last 10 to 15 years, that political order is falling apart. And now the clay is soft and there's a molten moment to create a new kind of political order to respond to 2 different internal and external crises. The internal crisis that we faced the last 15 years, I think, is a crisis of unaffordability, and especially a crisis of unaffordability in housing, and especially a crisis of unaffordability in housing in America's most productive cities. And then externally, just as America has had a hard time building in the US, we have the sort of looming presence of China showing us that a better model of building is possible. And there's a fear that's baked in about, are we losing something? Are we losing the technological frontier to the east? So Ezra and I are very motivated by this idea that the time is right for a new paradigm shift. Just as FDR concretized the ideas of his time in the 1930s, and neoliberalism was the right idea for the 1970s, 1980s, we think that it's time for a new kind of idea. A new paradigm for making it easier to build the most important things in this country, And that's the idea that we call abundance. It's about an abundance of housing, it's about abundance of energy, and it's also about an abundance of science and technology, because the long story of human progress really is a story of scientific and technological achievement. And so that's really where this project begins, I think, in the scale at which we're trying to achieve this sort of paradigm shift.
Okay, time for hating. So, so I posed to Twitter today, asking folks to send in
The platform of hating.
the platform of hating, yes, what everyone's favorite critiques of that they'd seen already of your book was. And the one that I saw probably most often was, why are you writing this book right now? Today I read a sworn affidavit that there is a man who's been an innocent man. The affidavit promises is sent to El Salvador and is being tortured without due process. You have Doge literally ripping apart the federal government, ending PEPFAR, which costs 1 million lives a year. You have many more things that we could all name up here that are extremely important, that are happening, and it doesn't feel like abundance is really an answer to what's going on. So is this just a function of publishing timelines?
I was going to say, well, we didn't write the book right now.
Yeah.
Look, the moment is incredibly dark. It's the darkest moment I can recall in politics, the darkest we have probably had, certainly in my lifetime. And Derek has talked about political orders and the molten clay of the moment, but politics isn't teleological. It doesn't bend, the arc of it doesn't bend towards justice. It can bend towards scarcity, towards authoritarianism, towards autocracy, towards oligarchy, towards kleptocracy. And at the moment, it's bending towards all of them. And this book is not an answer to the Trump administration unleashing ICE agents to build the muscle of harassing, jailing, torturing political enemies and unwanteds. It would be crazy to suggest that it is. But Doge is more interesting to me. Because what a good idea it would be for somebody to try Doge. What a good idea for somebody to try to actually make the government more efficient, as they promised to do. What Doge is a Department of Government Control. They are not trying to make anything more efficient. You don't hack into Social Security Administration if you want to make the government more efficient. You don't begin with USAID, which is the most cost-effective money we spend per life in the federal government. Certainly you don't hack into PEPFAR. The word efficiency in Doge is obfuscatory. You have to be efficient towards something. You have to know where you're going. And where they're going is somewhere incredibly dark. What Doge makes more efficient is the takeover of the federal government, the transformation of it into limbs of the MAGA movement. What they're trying to destroy in the government is capacity, expertise, and anyone who ideologically doesn't agree with them, or who they suspect might not agree with them. Behind Doge and behind Elon Musk is Russ Vought's long-term effort to create the unitary executive, to, as he put it, to traumatize the civil servants so that they are too afraid to ever speak up in a meeting and say, what you guys are doing is lawless or just a bad idea. It would be good to make government more efficient, though, but towards something, towards a vision of actually delivering for people. And a weakness of government, a weakness of liberal government in America and in other countries, is as it has become more complex, more procedural, more careful, it has become less responsive. People feel it less in their lives. New things are not happening that they like. We say in the beginning of the book, writing after an election that Democrats lost, that liberal democracy lost. And where you saw the sharpest shifts to the right in the states and cities that Democrats govern, right? Blue states and blue cities went further right than anywhere else. The swing in many parts of California and New York and Illinois was 10 points. After that, I think you have to look in the mirror and say, if you're somebody who believes in government, if you believe in liberal democracy, then clearly we are not delivering. Right? We are not delivering in a way that makes people want more of what we're offering. We're delivering in a way that's making people look for alternatives no matter how dark the garb they present themselves in is. So I actually think Doge sits as a somewhat frightening and ongoing lesson of what happens if you allow the divergence between the government and the people to grow too large. If at some point they stop believing you, when you say, we, the people believe in liberal democracy, we, the people believe in government, can use this government to make your life better. If they stop believing that promise, then they're going to turn to the people who have a different theory, the strongmen, the autocrats, the kleptocrats, the oligarchs, who say, look what I did in my life. Look how rich I got. Look how powerful I got. I alone can fix it.
In Derek's opening, right, he mentions what China has been able to build. And I want to push you here because, you're saying it'd be great if someone could do Ezra Klein's version of Doge, Jen Pahlka's version of Doge, a version that is reasoned, that cares about the outcome of liberalism, as we do on stage here. But there's a question of what actually happens when you empower government to act quickly and speedily, right? Peter Ganong, who is someone who you cite in your book as a core thinker and in the space of trying to make housing more abundant, and he called me today and he said, I'm really worried that this type of project could end up empowering people like Donald Trump, and you could have, you hear it in the language, right? You hear energy dominance. You hear things like there's a sense of Donald Trump just focusing on efficiency, and people are buying it. Many people are buying it. And I guess there's this question of, yes, there's like a theory of things, how things could work in an abstract way, but then there's reality where people do things that are illiberal when you give them that kind of power.
This is reality. We are in that world now. We allowed that world to happen with all of our procedures, all of our love of the rules and the institutions, with a presidential election where the Democrats formed a united front of people who believed the institutions were correct just as they were. And we opened the door enough that this came through it. Liberals have become so afraid of bad things happening that they cannot make enough good things happen. They've become so afraid of the government abusing its power that they don't allow the government to use its power for good. There's a great piece, Mark Dunkelman wrote a very related book called Why Nothing Works, but the core of that book was written some years ago in a great piece he wrote about Penn State and how hard it had been to remodel, to redo Penn Station in, not Penn State, I'm sorry, Penn Station. Penn State has its own problems. But Penn Station in New York City. And the point he made was that in this effort to make sure a Robert Moses could never happen again, in this effort to make sure that the government could not act in a way with such fearsome consequences for poor communities, for people who didn't have power, we made it too hard for the government to act consequentially. His book now has this epigraph that if Robert Moses was born today, he couldn't get shit done. And that's the reality of it. Yes, if you make it more possible to wield power, this is an older argument I have with people about things like the filibuster, you will make it more possible for power to be wielded in ways you don't like. And if the strategy of not allowing power to be wielded was working, then we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. But instead, hundreds of thousands of people are leaving California, Illinois, and Chicago, leading to, if this continues in the census of 2030, a red shift so large that a Democrat could win everything Kamala Harris won, add in the blue wall, and still lose the election. So I would say to the people who say, if we change things, bad things might happen. Bad things are happening. Maybe we should change things.
Derek, this is apparently not a compliment, but people say that you're very nice. And
you know, I've thought that about you.
And I guess my question here begins with some of the critiques that both of you have leveled against the Democratic Party and against liberals in general as being too coalition-minded. They're not willing to say, in service of some greater end, you know what? Like, yes, it's important to get affordable housing done, so we're going to allow modular development, even if that means less union jobs. We want energy to be built. We want batteries to be built. We want direct air capture plants to be built. And in service of that, that means we can't have 30 years of process that's blocking this. Some people have responded to this by saying this is just an anti-union. This is just an anti-union pitch. This is just saying you're going to oppose unions, you want to kick them out of the coalition. You're going to oppose environmentalists, you're going to kick them out of the coalition. And I guess my question is twofold. First, do you believe those things are true? And second, if they are true, are you too nice to kick anyone out of a coalition?
Yeah, this is going to be a therapeutic 5 minutes, I think, for me, in terms of evaluating my ability to be mean to people.
It's just me and you here, Derek.
These are all virtual creatures. OK, look. Let's talk about unions directly.
OK, but are you nice? Let's first.
Everyone on the stage is in a union. This is a fully unionized stage, if I'm wrong.
It's not accurate.
It's not accurate? OK, I'm sorry.
I am non-union
Ezra
eligible.
is management.
I didn't realize that.
I've been a member of unions when I've been
This
eligible.
is a supermajority unionized stage, is what I was trying to say. And let's just go forward with that supermajority here.
Thank you.
So I'm in a union, and I support unions. And I also think I recognize what unions are. They're a tool of power, right? A union is a tool of power. I think that's what a pro-union leftist would say. I think that's what an anti-union person on the right would say. Unions are a tool of power. Unions, as a useful tool of power, stand up against employer abuse and employer profit motive. They sometimes create ways of organizing a society with sectoral bargaining, which works really well in the Scandinavian states, and sometimes they just create flow of information within a company. Unions could do a lot of different jobs, but it's really important to ask, what job is the union doing in which cases? So this is a book in which, in many ways, one of the shifts that we're trying to do is to point out the degree to which liberalism has become too process-obsessed and not outcome-oriented. Right? That's the world of everything bagel liberalism. That's the world where there are so many riders to, say, public housing development in San Francisco, that in order to build Tahanan, the public housing sector, public housing structure that we talk, affordable housing structure, right, that we talk about in Chapter 4, it comes from private money because they need the private money rather than the strictures that come from public. So when I think about unions, public unions, I'm still thinking about outcomes. Let's think about Second Avenue subway and the construction of New York subway on the East Side. Right, this is the most expensive mile of subway in the world, $2 billion per mile of subway built on the east side of New York City. Why is it so expensive to build a subway in New York City? Well, if you ask the people at NYU and you ask a bunch of academics to research the problem, almost all of them will say that one of the inputs that's driving up the cost of building a subway in New York is the fact that the Sandhogs Union, which is building the tunnels, has a provision of their union contract that requires that more people be present at the digging, at the use of any digging equipment than's actually necessary to use the digging equipment itself, right? Which is essentially turning what should be a construction job for all of the residents in New York into a jobs program for a small number of people who benefit from that public union provision. I'm against that. I'll be mean about that. But that doesn't require me to position this book as anti-union. What I find really useful about being outcome-oriented and thinking, we really want to increase housing supply in San Francisco. We really want to make it cheaper to build subways and tunnels in New York City. We really want to make it easier to add solar and wind and geothermal and even maybe nuclear across the country to get beyond the environmental reviews and the permitting. We want to make it easier to build these things. Well, if you're outcome-oriented, then it allows you to see that sometimes unions are your friend and sometimes they're not. And I'm not prepared to wave a wand across all unions in America and say they're all good or they're all bad. That would frankly be incredibly simplistic, considering what unions are: a tool of power. And a tool can be used for good or for bad, but you have to be specific about what you're talking about.
I feel like that was still kind of a nice answer.
It was mean to the sandhogs. It was mean to this
No, because
a very
this is
specific
the
group.
thing. I think the thing I'm gonna add here, and Ezra, feel free to jump in here if you want, is when you have these discrete groups where you can point to the sandhogs are doing this, or this is what's happening in the case of the direct air capture plant here, or an affordable housing project there, or whatever. In New York, in particular, I think we see this problem happening a lot. But it's different when you're trying to craft a coalition, because you're not starting with what's the project, you're starting at the very beginning, right? You're starting with how do we build a legal regime and who's going to be involved in the process of developing that legal language. And Democrats have this issue where everyone has to be in the room, and so by the time any legislation gets finished, it has all these riders on it. So this is like a political question too. Like, are you saying that for Josh Shapiro, who wants to be president, or Gretchen Whitmer, who wants to be president, and make these changes, that they need to stop listening to these people?
I find that there is people in politics, when they start thinking coalitionally, they start to shut down in a funny way. They want to put people either inside or outside the coalition. And it's funny because both sides do it in different ways. One of the critiques my more moderate friends make of my friends on the left is like, they're always shrinking the tent. They're always saying who's got to be out of the tent. And then I'll get these.
You can just say Matt Iglesias.
I can just say Matt Iglesias. But Noah Smith, right? Like, it's a lot of people I really agree with. And then you'll get into a conversation like this, and I'll start getting these texts like, you really got to police the boundaries of abundance more aggressively. First, I'm not actually ready to shrink the tent, because I don't think we know who's in it and who's out of it, and also that will change on different issues. But also, I don't think it's how politics works. Politics is not these stable, unchanging coalitions. When I reported on Tahanan for the book, one of the conflicts of Tahanan was it was the first modular housing project, affordable housing built with modular housing done in San Francisco, maybe in California. And that made the Carpenters Union really mad, but also the modular construction factory was unionized, right? So there were different unions on both sides of that. And I've covered, by the way, a fair amount of housing legislation in California that had unions on both sides of it. And if you think about Democratic Party politics, there are fights with different interests in the room, and sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. My criticism of what happened in the culture of how Democrats made policy, from Obama to Biden, isn't that they let a lot of voices in the room. It's that they stopped saying no enough to the voices in the room. It's not like the teachers' unions weren't in the room for discussions of education reform in the Obama administration, but they got said no to a lot. You can say that was right or that was wrong, but that was how it worked. And the left got said no to a lot under the Obama administration. They were pretty good at saying no, and the reason they were good at saying no was that Obama was strong enough to hold his coalition together, that he had a lot of power over what we now talk about as the Obama coalition. The people came after him, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, just didn't. They didn't have that much power over it. And so they were much more coalitional, Hillary Clinton in the campaign and Biden as president, because they were really afraid of losing anyone. And so the problem is not that they had an inclusive room. The problem is not that they had a long table. The problem is that at the end of it, they didn't say no enough. That's the job of the leader. The job of the leader is to solicit the input and then make the hard decisions. And there's not a simple way to say, yeah, you should always make it this way, always make it that way. You shouldn't. Shapiro, when he fixes the I-95 bridge in 12 days instead of 12 months, he uses an emergency declaration, which wipes out a huge amount of environmental review, procurement rules, contracting rules, all kinds of things. But he keeps the unions on. He keeps it a union job. And those unions work 24/7. They kicked ass on that project. And it was a win for them, and it was a win for Shapiro, and it was a win for the people of Pennsylvania. It's a win for everybody who does business in the Northeast Corridor. You don't say no to everybody on a project. You say no to what won't make the project work. At their ideal, what unions do is help you have incredibly skilled and committed labor on projects. Unions are better at apprenticeship than most companies are. Unions are able to glue workers to a job site in a way corporations can't. They surface information in a way others don't. And they can also turn toxic. Unions, I love how Derek put it, unions are instruments of power. I think one way to say what we are going for in a lot of this book is we want high productivity government, we want a high productivity country, and that also means high productivity unions. And places where those things can converge are probably going to be pretty friendly, and where they don't, we won't. But we are actually against this form of politics that tells you can just like wave a wand. I'm sure at some point we're going to talk about corporate power tonight.
About to get to it.
Yeah, so there is just no one master explanation for everything. You got to take things case by case and make good decisions about them because you have good rules in your mind for how to make decisions, but the rules are not themselves the decisions.
So that was a great transition. We've
Thank
actually
you.
planned that. A lot of people say to me and to you guys very stridently in multiple arenas, particularly reviews that have come out of folks in the anti-monopoly movement, that YIMBYs, yes, my backyard advocates, abundance advocates, abundance liberals don't have a theory of power. And I think specifically what they're trying to say is that they don't have a theory of corporate power, that if you look at the economy right now and you see how, I mean, right now, and of course, in Elon Musk, you are literally seeing a billionaire fueled by corporate power, able to really take over the entire government of the richest country in the world. And they're saying this book, this theory of government, does not actually provide an answer to that problem. And I think to steelman this point, right? Because I think that sometimes it can seem like, well, two great tastes that taste great together, right? Like you should have anti-monopoly and you should do YIMBYism. But I think part of the question is, why is the book silent on this? Because if it is such an important issue, if it is something that you've seen the Democratic Coalition care a lot about, really in centering people like Lena Khan, Gary Gensler, and other folks in this space, why don't you all talk about the corporate power that is underlying so much of our lives?
So a couple things. So one, this is a book about the problem of supply. The problem that crops up across a bunch of domains where we feel liberals neglect the problem of supply. It is a book about what we think of as a neglected problem in liberalism. It's not a book about problems we don't feel are neglected in modern American liberalism. We didn't feel a lot of need to go through the book saying, just to reassure you, we support progressive taxation. Because, I don't know, we don't have a lot of edits to make on the corporate taxation side of the liberal platform. I do support universal health care. I've spent a huge amount of my time as a journalist working on it. But it's not a book about health insurance. It just isn't. Corporate power, I don't want to soft pedal this because I'm meaner than Derek, but not as mean as Matt Iglesias.
We are friends with Matt, just want to make that clear.
Matt is very dear to me. I think that the anti-monopolist tendency in the party, while I agree with them on many issues, can become monomaniacal about their focus. They sometimes have a tendency to, as the old joke about Rudy Giuliani went, the sentence is a noun and a verb in monopoly power. And sometimes monopoly power is really the problem. And my view is that there's been a big policy revolution on that. I'm not really 100% sure how well it has worked out. They keep telling us we don't have a theory of power. No, they had a administration in which they were ascendant, and it did not seem to lead to more power for liberals, nor break up the kind of concentrated power of the economic royalists. So I think that before you, like, I don't think corporate power, I'll say this, it's a little bit downstream of political power. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure either of us have a full theory of political power. Political power is complicated and multifaceted and not always in our control. There are absolutely places where there is too much corporate concentration. And there are, I mean, definitely we have an economy and a country where wealth and income inequality confer, and frankly, attentional power, confer too much power on a very small number of people. Okay. We don't think liberalism is blind to that form of power. We think it knows how to see it and knows how to talk about it. We do think liberalism is pretty blind to a bunch of other forms of power. What happens in housing is the application of power. It is the application of the power of incumbent homeowners the application of the power of HOAs, of covenants. There's a great law paper by David Schleicher and a co-author whose name is slipping my mind about the movement in property law away from dynamism and towards stasis. And he talks about the law of the gentry, right? The gentry have a lot of power in homes, and that power has been used ruthlessly and has transformed millions and millions of lives and life trajectories in this country. When we talk about what it takes to build clean energy, the law is power. Environmental legislation is power. The groups that keep that legislation going and have expanded it, the courts that interpreted that legislation and made that legislation stronger, that is power. When we talk about state capacity, the government is power. And the interest groups inside the government, including public interest unions, public unions, that is power. There are many levels at which power operates. And what we are trying to do is shine a light on neglected ones. One of the difficult things for anybody in any political movement is that there's always enemies you're comfortable with and enemies you're uncomfortable with, or at least antagonists you're uncomfortable with. And so for the right now, an immigrant, they are very comfortable with that enemy, right? They want that to be their enemy. Liberals, they hate liberals. If you think the Trump administration is doing a bad job on something, you're in real trouble over there, right? Liberals, though, we're very comfortable with the rich as the enemy. If something's wrong in healthcare, like, better damn well hope it's the fault of private health insurance. If something's wrong in the economy, better damn well hope it's a fault of the rich and the wealthy. Because when it's not, or not entirely, when it's maybe our fault, when it's the fault maybe of our allies, or maybe just of the decisions we made without quite realizing it, or maybe of the overhang of the legislation of the past into the present, or maybe a body of administrative law that is built up that isn't suited for today's problems, then we have a real problem because we don't really like to look at it. We explain it away, we move on from it. It is power that created the rules that made it so California could not build high-speed rail. But it is because it's a form of power that liberals are not comfortable confronting that we have done nothing about it. And that is a failure to confront power, not one that is contradictory to the need to confront corporate power or economic power, just one that is less comfortable for us than those.
Derek, I want to bring you in here because I think that part of the critique that's being made is that this movement is a pro-growth movement. Mm-hmm. And the way pro-growth movements have worked, particularly in the United States, is being pro-business. And that can be pro-developer, which is very unpopular within the party. That can be it can be pro-environmental degradation as a result of development and things like that. And I think the thing that's raising for a lot of people is not just the specifics of the policies that Ezra laid out, it's also that it seems like the alliance that you guys are asking for, or that Abundance is asking for, is to bring liberals closer to businesses. And that many people think, or at least many loud people on Twitter, I don't think there's been a poll, but there's a critique that's really floating around out there that what is being done here is that it's laundering sort of a moderate centrist vision of returning to neoliberalism, returning to deregulation, returning to business as the ally, and that is actually the secret agenda that you all have.
Yeah, Derek.
So, Derek.
What about that?
Okay.
I want to be clear, they told me to be mean.
This is great. You're doing great.
Can we just be real here?
Yeah.
It's not 1932. There's no Works Progress Administration coming to build our homes, and our solar, and our wind. The houses are going to be built largely by companies. The solar is going to be built by companies. The infrastructure is going to be built, in many cases, by companies. To have the progressive outcomes that we're rooting for and to root against companies is to have fully divorced the world that you want from the means to get there. That's number one. Number two, on the issue of oligarchy, I love how Ezra put it. And one more piece here that I think is that frustrates me about the antitrust folks is that if you want to understand why Texas builds homes and California does not, what is oligarchy doing for you there? Is there more oligarchy in California than in Texas? Is that why Texas is building and California is not? Is the reason that Georgia is adding so much solar and battery technology because of a critical lack of oligarchy in the larger Atlanta region? Like, what are we actually talking about
Lena
here?
Khan moved to Atlanta.
I'm sorry?
Lena Khan moved to Atlanta.
Oh, did she really?
No, I made that up.
So
Yeah.
I just don't think that the tool that they've used to explain the world, in fact, explains the world. What they have instead is a very specifically colored set of glasses that they use to look upon the world. And sometimes it explains history beautifully, and sometimes it explains the most important problems that we face today terribly. Like, one place where I will be nice to the antitrust folks is that if you look, for example, at the most important economies, most important industries of California, right? What are they? It's Hollywood and it's the software industry. How did Hollywood and the software industry get their start? Turns out that in the 1910s, there was an Edison trust that controlled all of the camera machines and all of the equipment for film. And there was an antitrust remedy that broke up the Edison trust, and all the people that wanted to make movies suddenly went to Los Angeles, and we have a riotously successful industry that is world-leading at building video entertainment. I mean, so in many ways, Hollywood was created by an antitrust remedy, and I thank the antitrust folks for that. If you look at software, it was incredibly important that the US government had a consent decree with AT&T such that the patents that came up in Bell Labs had to be licensed for free so that when they invented the transistor, the guts of the modern electronics revolution, they had to let Texas Instruments have it, they had to let Shockley have it, and then you had the rise of Silicon Valley in California. California should thank the history of antitrust for the pillars of its economy. But just because antitrust can explain a few stories in American history doesn't mean it's the only thing that has explanatory power for all of American history. And that's the conflation that's been made. I really think it's important to realize that, like, yes, I get, and this is in your question, there has been this, like, weird divorce among liberals between liberals who feel comfortable with business and liberals or people on the left who consider liberal comfort with business to be some kind of stain on progressive identity. It's a market economy. I support progressive taxation and redistribution. I support antitrust that especially looks after consumers. I support the application of the law, and I certainly support rules that keep modern billionaires from essentially speed-running the Gilded Age in 2025. But business is going to build so much of what we need to be built, and having a political philosophy that tries to push them out of the tent makes absolutely no sense to me.
I'm going to riff on this for a second. There's a great Francis Fukuyama line. We talked about neoliberalism earlier. And he says something like, neoliberalism is not the veneration of the market. It's the denigration of the state. One of the things where I feel the political categories we have are a little topsy-turvy is I want to see the state strong enough to do the things it promises. We have sort of deregulation as this right-wing coded word. If you're talking about deregulation, and it's so funny, like it gets thrown at us like an incantation. Like, if they can make it stick, then the sort of the stain of the right wing will spread.
Reagan just appears behind you.
And people will be able to see what we're really up to here. Yes, as Derek said, much of what we need to build will be built by the market, by businesses, by corporations. But there's a bunch of things we actually do need government capable of building, and the problem right now is it's not capable of building it. And the thing that drives me the craziest about some of my friends on the left is they don't seem to care. It's not just that they don't seem to care, they don't follow up. They don't go back and see how it worked out. I am just rip shit about California high-speed rail, and I don't understand why every liberal isn't. I'm not just angry that it's not going to happen. I'm angry that we learned nothing. How is it sitting there not happening and we haven't changed anything? The Second Avenue subway, the most expensive rail project by kilometer the world has ever known, is the next phase projected to be cheaper? Nah, more expensive. The hell? I am fine. AOC has a bill to do a bunch of public housing. It's getting rebranded these days social housing. Great. Look into what happens when you trigger public money in housing. We cannot build public housing at scale under these rules. I want whoever can build the housing to build it. I have this sort of dream that the federal government will take land that it owns in places like San Francisco and erect gleaming skyscrapers of housing on it. Make like a little charter city near San Francisco that just goes up into the sky and houses thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But not the way it builds now, it won't. If you want the government to do these things, you actually have to deregulate the government itself. Deregulation is not just for the market, and often shouldn't be for the market. But it often does need to happen for government, and this is a genuine blind spot. I mean, look, I'm a policy reporter, and I am myself very guilty of this. There's a tendency, we get all excited about the fight over the bill. And then the bill passes, we celebrate, we'll write some pieces, and Politico does a TikTok of how the bill passed. And it's like, well, I guess hope that works out. And then you start looking into what happened after the bill passed. And it's like, that $42 billion we passed for rural broadband, how much rural broadband did it create? Basically none. That's $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging networks across the country. Have you used them? No, they don't exist. One problem with that is you can't run on it. So there's your problem with your theory of power. The other problem with it is that it didn't happen. And fine, you can screw up. I screw up all the time. But you want to go back and figure out why and make sure you're not going to screw up next time. And we don't do that enough. I used to joke that this isn't a liberalism that builds. It's a liberalism that pays attention to the details. Too often we pass a big thing and then the interests and their power descend on the process. When there's attention, when the press is paying attention, when some voters are paying attention, there's actually some checks. And like Congress is in there arguing about things, but then everybody moves on, and that's where like the entire ecosystem descends on the regulatory process. And when it just fails, failure has 1,000 fathers, it turns out. You just run on something else. I don't think that's good enough. So I'm a little bit, like, fine, if you want to accuse me of being pro-business, I am pro-business when it comes to achieving things I would like to see achieved. But I would like my leftist friends to be more pro-government. I would like us to demand that government can actually do the things we keep saying it can do. Because otherwise, it's not just that the politics isn't going to work out, but the actual policy won't work out. And like, then what are we here for?
So both of you have made a version of the argument that has been also tarred against you. So Derek, that's been tarred against you as well. So there's basically, Ezra, I think you said, what was it? Noun, verb, monopoly. And some people say, all you can say is noun, verb, abundance. Malcolm Harris wrote this.
This just came out.
Yeah, noun, verb, abundance. Yeah, the book is
doing a
54 hours old. Yeah.
So there's a sense to which, I came into this through housing, and then you see land use issues, you see energy, you see transit. Your book goes beyond that. You start talking about scientific technology, you start talking about medicine, and Malcolm Harris writes this review in The Baffler that I found interesting, and he makes the argument that to you all, when abundance is all you, I guess I'm mangling this metaphor, but when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but put in abundance where that's supposed to go.
When all you have is a cornucopia, everything looks like an overflowing thing of grapes.
Exactly. Thank you. Derek, do you only have a hammer? Do you need a screwdriver?
I'm not even sure. I don't accept the criticism at all. I'm just getting meaner and angrier as we go. We're like a totally new person by the time this hour's over. Just a full personality change. I honestly think it's the exact opposite. We don't only have a hammer. we're not wedded to the tools that we're using to try to get to a place. That's antitrust. That's Malcolm Harris's communism, right? I mean, that is the ultimate hammer, so to speak, to solve every single nail. We believe very, very strongly that you want to focus on outcomes and then reason back from what is necessary to get there. Ezra brought up BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which I think is a fascinating story for these purposes. So to take you back to 2021, Joe Biden signs the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and he and Pete Buttigieg brag fairly that it is the most impressive infrastructure bill passed in several generations. And it's true, it is $1.2 trillion to build and build. You'd think that this entire book would just be one long epic poem to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's not. Why? Because $42 billion to build broadband for rural areas was basically not spent at all. And when you look into it, how did you not spend $42 billion? Well, what they did is they created a 14-step process by which states and localities could apply for the funding. And then you look into those 14 steps. Step number 1, the FCC makes a map to say, here are the parts of the country that are underserved with rural broadband. And then there's a challenge period where the states can say, you said that we don't have rural broadband there, but actually we do have the rural broadband there. And then finally the states can start to apply for the money. And the Commerce Department can say, you didn't have enough, the equity matrices weren't right here, and the workforce development program wasn't right here. And so there's back and forth there, and yada, yada, yada. We're 4 calendar years later, and practically nothing has been built. And so Donald Trump's going to scrap the entire program and just give it to Elon Musk. That's not political success. That's pathetic, right? Now, here's the problem. If you go through those 14 steps and you evaluate them step by step to say, was it right for the FCC to draw a map? Was it right for there to be a challenge period? Was it right for them to care about equity in the workforce? Was it right for them to care about a procurement process? You can say yes, 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 yes to every single step and mid-step inside of those 14 steps. You can say yes to all of it. It's all so damn reasonable that they're the proverbial sesames on the everything bagel of everything that makes the black hole from which no light can emerge.
I really want, there's nothing wrong with the sesames. That's one of the things you can have.
Ezra, no one understands the metaphor. No one understands
Co-author
it.
for 3 years, I have no idea what he's talking
Till
about.
the end of my days, I'm like, no, it's the bagel from everything, everywhere, all at once, not the normal bagel.
I don't think anyone read that essay. I want to be clear.
It's fair.
So
I do just want to say also, it would be crazy. I actually think that's a good critique. And I really do want to say that there's always a danger of that. Anytime you get too into an idea, too into a word, too into a lens, not every problem is a supply problem. Just isn't, right? We should have a child tax credit. We should just, my wife, Annie Lowry, wrote the book, Give People Money. There's a lot of times we should just give people money. One of the things we say at the beginning of the book is that the problem is when we give people money for something that we have choked off supply of. So if you give people rental vouchers, but there aren't enough houses, then you push up prices. If you give people Pell Grants, but you haven't made enough higher education institutions, you push up prices. But oftentimes you do just want to give people money, and we should give people a bunch more money. And we should give people who don't have health insurance, so that insurance should be good. You really don't want to get monomaniacal about this stuff. And that's one failure mode of what we're doing here is I don't think it's our specific failure mode, but I could imagine it happening, is that it does become a Trojan horse for just a very certain kind of politics that finds abundance a convenient way to ignore a set of problems it is uncomfortable with, right? Abundance is a sunny way to talk about what's possible in the economy, so we don't ever talk about corporate power or oligarchy or wealth concentration. Abundance is a great way to think about housing, and so we don't actually think about problems that require more class conflict, say, to solve. So I do just want to say that, I don't think we are doing it, but I could really see that happening. You don't want to become like that, right? You want to maintain sort of flexibility in the models you apply to the world.
So one of the things I loved about your book, I always do this, I say it in the middle. I love the book. The book's great.
This is off key.
Sorry, too nice. I'm rolling it back. Is you do a really great explanation of agglomeration economies, but nobody wants to hear that, so I'm going to ask you a question that kind of gets at it.
Yeah, they tried to get me to take that out.
Really?
I did not try to get you to take it out.
Sure.
I was editing certain paragraphs out, and Ezra said no. And what's so fascinating, honestly, is that we just had this conversation yesterday. I was like, there's so many people who are asking the question, why don't you talk more about how, like, your obsession with just like a handful of cities? What's with your obsession with cities? And I was like, I cannot believe that A, I don't know how you read this book and don't have that question answered, but B, it's ironic that I did try to take about 50% of that out.
I mean, they didn't read the book. That's the answer. But so the reason I'm going to ask this question, which Derek has just kind of previewed for you. Zephyr Teachout, in a critique of your book, says, it cannot be that people need to move to a handful of elite coastal cities to produce abundance. A lot of YIMBYism is about building in productive cities and suburbs, about the agglomeration that produces higher wages, higher GDP growth, et cetera. And this is a question from Kate. Is Kate in the room? No, maybe on live stream? Sorry, Kate. So she asks, how do you see the loneliness epidemic factoring into the politics of abundance? And the way I want you to get into this is about communities being left behind. Because I think this is a critique I hear a lot. And I hear this in Zephyr's quote, in her argument. And is this just the case where you're saying everyone needs to live in like 5 cities in America and fuck everyone who doesn't move there? I don't care. Are we allowed to curse? I'm sorry.
But we are
now.
So there are your critics you don't really like, and then your critics you do. And I really have a lot of respect for Zephyr. I think she's great. I did find this critique. There are ones you don't realize are coming because it just like didn't make sense in the way you thought about it. I'm going to hold loneliness to the side. The conversation we are engaging in the housing chapter is a conversation with the people who want to restrict the supply of housing. And the thing you will hear if you live in these cities, and Zephyr lives in New York City, so she knows this happens, is people in the areas where they don't want to build housing say, not everybody gets to live here. And not just random residents. Mayor Michael Bloomberg used to say, New York City is a luxury good. Luxury goods have luxury prices. I quote him saying that, or something very similar to it in the book. I hear it all the time in San Francisco, right? Yeah, not everybody gets to live here. The reason we spend a bunch of effort, the reason I expended such tedious effort on why it is really, really, really important for people to be able to move to cities and take advantage of the opportunity and innovation that happens in the high productivity, economically hot cities, is that when you don't, you haven't just said, well, you got to live somewhere else. You have walled people off from one of the most fundamental forms of mobility that has ever existed in our economy or any other. The way people get richer is they move to richer places. That is always how we have done it. It is not the only way we do it. And it does not answer the question of what to do about a city that has seen its core industries hollowed out. It doesn't answer the question for rural areas, but it is a question you can't just skip over. It really is very important. And if we are successful in other kinds of revitalization projects, you might have that question in different cities, right? If things really boom in Milwaukee or Atlanta, they might begin to try to gate themselves too. So one thing is not having that happen, right? One thing that I do respect about Texas is that in part because of how expensive things got in California, they have seen a lot of people trying to move, and not trying, succeeding, they do it easily, move to Austin or Houston. This is happening right now in Montana. A lot of people from California have moved to Montana. This is happening in Colorado. A lot of people from California moved to Denver. And so each one of these states is facing this question, which is, well, we kind of like things the way they are, maybe. Maybe we just shouldn't let this happen. Maybe we should pick up all of these growth control policies that California and other places have used and keep our places from changing. And every one of those places is not doing that, to their credit. And they're not doing it in Colorado, which is run by Jared Polis, a Democrat. And they're not doing it in Montana, which just passed a great raft of YIMBY legislation. And they're not doing it in Texas, where they've had incredible responsiveness in home building in Austin and Houston. So which cities are hot at any given moment is not static. Then there's the whole rest of the book. And our ability to innovate, Our ability to build out the big projects of the federal government is part of our strategy for increasing economic activity and opportunity in the places Zephyr is talking about. So when we talk about rural broadband, which is not, to be fair, in the book, it's not a major example in the book, but that's obviously an effort to help the economies and just the lives of people in more underserved rural communities. If we can't get that right, we are failing them. People in San Francisco, they've got plenty of broadband. They got much too much broadband in San Francisco. The same is true when we talk about the difficulties in sort of rolling out, although I think they sort of ultimately got figured out, in the chips and science effort to place these big semiconductor fabs, right? But the Biden administration there did something that we are big fans of, which is they ultimately exempted the fabs from NEPA, from the National Environmental Policy Act. They did the kind of thing we're talking about. And those got placed in places like Arizona, and they're going to be really good for those economies. But if you made them too hard to build, or if you make the program fail by layering it under too much regulation and red tape and other standards, that's going to be bad for those areas. There is a specific reason you need to treat economically dynamic cities as public goods. A specific reason you can't just leave it to the preferences of the people who already live there. But the rest of the book isn't about 5 or 10 cities. The rest of the book is applicable to the policy we use, or at least some of the policies we use everywhere in the country. And even the question of housing is applicable because, over a 10 or 15 or 20-year time frame, where people want to live does change. And one thing we want to see, look, for all the intellectual victories of the IMBYs, they're not building more housing in California. But they're like, you look so upset. They're not, are they?
Okay. I think this is a take where I'm like, you're right that they're not building as much as you'd expect, but 1 in 5 homes in California is an ADU. 1 in 5 homes, 20% of housing that's being built right now in California is an ADU, which is only something that was legalized because of the IMBY movement. So I agree with you that a lot of the bills have not, but none is a bit. Sorry, we're getting too wonky.
Yes, the ADUs are the in-law units are that's a big victory, but I just don't think of those as homes. I mean, most people don't live in an ADU.
Oh my God, Ezra. Okay.
I think I look at the Fred data.
My friend lives in an ADU. People live in ADUs.
I think we should be able to build family housing.
Sure.
Like multifamily. I think we should be able to build. When you look at housing starts on Fred, we should be able to build private homes, not just ADUs.
I agree. The structural point you're making about townhomes.
I think if you're saying we can build ADUs, but not broader homes, we've set it too low. But putting our ADU disagreement aside, the issue in California is that it's actually really hard to reverse these policies once they get into play. Even the ADU story took 10, 15, 30 years, right? We've been working on that for a very long time. So it's actually really important that other places begin to see big pickups in the real estate markets. Don't begin putting in the wrong legislation now. Because if we've learned anything in all of this, it's that it's much easier to keep a default that is open to building than unwind a default that became hostile to building.
Derek, I want to bring you in on this question, but I also want to say, in spirit of being mean, the thing I looked up, though, is Zephyr moved from Vermont to New York City herself and is making this critique. And I'm just going to say this, so many times when critiques like this are made, they're made by people living in the cities that are actually productive. So when I hear someone living in Brooklyn or DC or Denver or Seattle saying, hey, we really need to invest in the heartland, go move to the heartland. No one is stopping you. So, Derek.
Yes.
So, the one thing I want to ask, and this is, I want to pull a question from Arvin. Is Arvin here? Oh my God, Arvin! Hi.
Arvin.
So Arvin asks, I will find his question. Arvin asks, it takes time to build things, and the political cycle is getting shorter and shorter. How do you think about your abundance agenda in the context of providing very short-term political wins? And I want to tie in the critiques that have been made about this broadly around whether this book is actually trying to make a political argument or is just a book that's a bunch of good ideas you guys think should happen and it would be good if someone did it. Because some of the marketing of the book, the way you guys are talking about it, and obviously also it's not fully your fault, but the timing of when it's coming out, is leading people to believe that you guys are trying to hand Democrats the playbook for how they should win in midterms, in following the election, in the presidential election. And so I guess my question for you is, Arvin's asking whether or not that's even possible, given the timelines of building things. But also, is that what you're trying to do? Are you trying to help Democrats win?
Well, we're liberals, and we vote for Democrats. And certainly in the two-party system that we have today...
You don't know who I vote for.
I'm sorry, I don't know. We never discussed this.
You voted for RFK?
Yeah.
Maintain some mystery.
On one sense, of course, what we want to do is to build a stronger Democratic Party. I mean, especially today, that the Democratic Party is so fantastically unpopular and so ineffective in the places where it has the most power, right? And we didn't realize that when this book would come out, March 2025, the Democratic Party would poll, according to CNN, at 29%, the lowest in the history of that time series.
Also, this book was supposed to come out in late 2024, like sort of mid-2024. Just things got,
Yeah, things, we
hard to
got
finish
busy,
books.
essentially. So absolutely, we're trying to have an influence within the liberal movement. But the kind of influence we're trying to have and the level that we're trying to have it, I think, has sometimes been misunderstood. I think we do a pretty good job in the conclusion of this book being very explicit about the fact that we could have ended Abundance, the book, with a list. We could have said, here's the 10 things you should do in San Francisco and the 19 things you should do in Los Angeles, and we should just have like an enormous tearaway page that unfolds and becomes like some enormous poster that people can hang in their rooms. But it would literally take that much space in order to have a full list that accounted for all the various ways that the ideas of abundance can be applied at the federal, state, and local level. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to end, as we said, not with a list, but with a lens. We want people to see the world just a little bit differently. And I do think that right now, the lens that we offer is incredibly relevant for American politics in this moment. Because Donald Trump won in 2024 on one major issue. It was affordability. If you ask the people that switched from the Democratic column to the Republican column, it was affordability. If you ask young people why they voted for Republicans at historic rates, it was affordability. And underneath that, underneath all of affordability, the biggest ticket item is housing. So in many ways, 2024 was a housing affordability election. And what does Trump do? He comes into office. He could have rolled out an affordability agenda. He could have said, I'm looking at Texas. I'm going to be a Texas Republican. We're just going to make America exactly like Texas. He does not do that at all. One of the first things that he does instead is raise tariffs on Canada and Mexico by 25%. Two really, really important parts of building a house: lumber and drywall. Our biggest lumber imports come from Canada. Our biggest drywall imports come from Mexico. So the first thing that he did is raise the material inputs for building the kind of houses whose unaffordability was the reason that he won. That is a classic scarcity mindset. And it's not just there, right? Every single time Trump and the White House seem to identify something that America doesn't have enough of, they take away something else that we need. They say, you don't have enough manufacturing, so we're going to take away trade. You don't have enough houses, so we're going to clamp down the borders and have less immigration. We don't have enough high-quality science, according to RFK Jr., interesting judge, so we're going to absolutely slash NIH funding and just punish universities for the sin of having played by old rules. I mean, that is over and over again an example of meeting scarcity with scarcity. And in that context, I think the paradigm shift of this book just couldn't be clearer. We're for growth, married to progressive outcomes. But we're also for, and this is at the higher level of vibes, right? This idea that a negative identity for a political movement is so easy. I mean, especially when your opponent is Donald Trump. It's just not hard to come up with what you're not. Every day in the newspaper, you just open it up and read the top headline. That's what you're not. The negative identity of the liberal movement in America is not difficult to articulate. What's harder to articulate is a positive vision. Okay, if you get power, what will you do with it? Well, it turns out that liberals have power in San Francisco and Los Angeles and California and New York and Illinois and Minnesota and Oregon. And people are leaving. To Ezra's first point, people are leaving the places where we have the most power. So what we're trying to do above all is to shine a big fat bat signal into the sky and say, this is actually a problem. The governance problem is the reputation problem. It's the same problem. And if you want to mount a successful and popular and effective rebuttal to Donald Trump, you have to begin by proving the success of your own movement in the backyards where you have power. So, no, we do not have a perfect list of what abundance should be in 2027. Who could? But I do think that the utility of a book like this is to offer the people who are doing that thinking in 2027, and maybe even if we're lucky, offer the people who are running for office in 2027, 2028, give them a lens that can offer Americans something that I think they are quite starving for, which is not just the negative vision of negative polarization, but the positive vision of what happens if we get power and how it improves people's lives.
So we're running late, but I have 2 more questions, so you guys are going to keep running late with me. Sorry. Kind of jumping off what you just said, Ezra, and in the book you begin and you say that the book is being written to liberals, right? And Derek has just articulated a case for trying to reshore the Democratic Party, which is the home of liberalism in the United States right now. I've heard from some folks in the abundance movement, folks who work on YIMBY advocacy at various times, not just right now, when the DNC was happening and you saw Barack Obama saying, we got to build more homes. You saw Kamala Harris making it more of a centerpiece in her campaign, the idea of reducing regulatory constraints on home building. And there's a concern that this book could negatively polarize Republicans and conservatives, who have often been, as you mentioned already, some of the champions of these policies in their own state. I mean, I just saw today, this actually threw me for a loop. The lieutenant governor of Texas said that because home prices had reached $323,000 in Texas, the median home price, that it was an emergency. And I was like, dear God. Okay. And so, there's a concern from people who are working on this that this kind of rhetoric, this kind of language can make it harder to make these sorts of deals in states where Republicans are in charge or you have to work with them.
That's why it's so important that the Twitter left is polarized so hard against this book.
We welcome the hatred.
I actually really was not sure ideologically where this book would fit, because I could have seen a lot of ways it made different spots mad. Fundamentally, this is a book about creating a more powerful government able to complete bigger projects. That is really at its heart. It is a book about state capacity. Sometimes the state will work through the market, sometimes through its own capabilities, but in both cases, we are talking about goals that are set collectively at the state level and how to accomplish them. And yet, this book is traveling really well to places like the Free Press, run by Barry Weiss, or over to Lex Friedman. It's getting a very nice response over there. I think in part because it smuggles in an argument for big government through a critique of liberal failures. Mm-hmm. It's
Don't tell them.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're not gonna. It's like on the high level, it's there's a little bit of a little bit of lib owning. Mm-hmm. And if you just do enough lib owning, then let's all get together on building massive amounts of public housing. Yeah, maybe the government can create a huge charter city on the outskirts of San Francisco. So I am not personally worried about that. I also think there's an interesting way in which the YIMBY movement, and I was gesturing at this a few minutes ago, if you look at, say, the legislation that's passed in Montana or things that have happened in Florida, it's been very successful in red states, I think in part because it hasn't made them too defensive. The YIMBY movement has, at least in its earlier guises, I know they don't really want to be seen like this now, but it was understood as such an intra-party critique of Democrats that Republicans were just sort of able to pluck the parts of it they liked out. And then they've been doing it. So in practice, I don't think it's played out that way. I think both parties have a scarcity side and an abundance side. This is a cleavage that cuts inside both of them. Derek just gave a good description of the scarcity side in the Republican Party. It's the one in power. That's the side that is in power. And as he likes to put it in other
interviews is wearing the rest of the Republican Party as a hat. Like, you cannot fight Donald Trump on the Republican side. You just can't. It's going to be whatever he wants. On the Democratic side, it's more jumbled right now. These are more cross-cutting. There's no decider. Things like there isn't a leader of the party right now. The leaders of the party are, in fact, as we speak, at war with each other. And in a lot of us, both tendencies conflict. Right? There's this sort of older environmental movement, and it's still in most of us that wants to conserve, that worries about the expansion of construction into green space, that wishes sort of we could save the world by just not doing anything, just stopping things from happening, right? And then there's a side that has, I think, recognized that our pathway out of climate change, or the worst of it, if there is one, is going to be torrid building of green infrastructure. And so there's a kind of live fight there. But I think because this creates hard questions on both sides, I don't think it polarizes in the same way. And that, to me, is part of its appeal. When you're talking about a polarized political system, the nature of polarization changes. We've gone from polarization, in the 2012 era that was over the Affordable Care Act and over Grover Norquist's tax pledge and Paul Ryan's Medicare bill. It was so innocent, such an innocent time. And now the polarization is much less over those issues and much more over the legitimacy of the system itself. Who can be here? What kind of freedoms will the people who are here have? It's become much more fundamental. It's a very unhealthy form of polarization. Like, should we have elections that are free and fair is not a healthy form of polarization. I would much prefer to see fights over supply. Fights over abundance. I would prefer to force Republicans to defend that terrain, right? I want to push, like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, to defend why they're making everything more expensive, why they're depriving America of the genius and the entrepreneurship and the work ethic that so many people want to bring to this country. This idea that immigration is a source of national weakness, it is a pulsing source of our strength. Always has been. Like, that is terrible ground for them. Now, Democrats screwed that up by allowing the border to become completely disordered, right? They made that into a weakness. But it's going to be a long 4 years. And by the end of that, if we're in shape to have these kinds of conversations as a country, by the end of that, I don't think it's going to be, I think a lot of people, as they think about politics going forward, think about rerunning the last election and not making the mistakes they feel they made over the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. And so Democrats are thinking a lot about how to move right on immigration, on issues of gender and sexual identity, on DEI, right? It all got too woke. I think by the time we're 3 years in the future, cruelty, not wokeness, is going to be the heart of that kind of politics. And I actually worry about Democrats not seeing that coming. The thing that I think they could profitably repent for and change, that I think will still be very much there and is just going to define at least the economics out of American politics for a long time, is affordability. I think that what's going to happen is a handoff from one form of unaffordability to another. And so it's still going to be there. So I think the politicians right now who are swinging very hard on social issues on the Democratic side, it's not going to play out the way they're looking for it to. Because I don't think the politics of that is static. The Trump administration is going to overreach. And the American people don't like disorder, but they also don't like cruelty. But everybody agrees that life should be more affordable. Everybody agrees we should have more opportunity. And so for the Democratic Party to actually show that it has learned some lessons there and win back some credibility on the set of issues that in every survey and in all the data we know dominated in 2024, but also dominates most of the time in elections. It's not like cost of living just reared its head for the first time in 2024. Like, that's always there. I think that is a great place to try to get the highest ground you possibly can.
So I have one final question. It's going to go to the both of you. It's about the sword of Damocles, figuratively, lying above our heads. Artificial intelligence, which is something that...
I was like, we're in a synagogue. I was like, God?
mentions artificial intelligence, and it mentions it mostly to talk about the energy that it's going to demand in order to fuel all the data centers that power that technology. And that's the lens that it touches on it. But I have two questions I'm going to pose to both of you. One, it seems that meeting this demand, even if every policymaker in the country right now were to just view this as, I'm a Christian, the Bible, I don't know, what are we saying, the Torah? Sorry.
We're going to release a version on scrolls
My
soon, don't worry.
name's Jerusalem, I'm not Jewish. Even if every single policymaker were to become abundance pilled right now, it seems like fossil fuels are going to play a large role in the energy demand that we're talking about here. And not just maintaining the current existing infrastructure, but likely even increasing the amount of fossil fuels that are built in the United States. So one, how do you think about that problem? And the second is, given that both of you seem to believe it's possible that AGI could be coming quite soon, what does abundance as a frame have to even say about that?
So it's true that the way that AI appears in this book is primarily through the lens of how we think it's going to make contact with federal policy, which is AI is unbelievably energy intensive. And unless artificial intelligence is essentially going to be banned, it's going to continue to need more energy built, more energy sourced, more data centers, significantly more electricity. Now, the ruling regime simply does not care about climate change. Just doesn't care at all. And Ezra and I care about climate change very deeply. And so our idea, which cannot be instantiated in a Trump administration, but can be instantiated in the next administration, is that we need to get out of our own way on solar and wind and geothermal so much more than was necessary in a world without AI. That right now, you've had decades where we understood how to build solar and wind, we understood how to build these technologies, but we simply didn't. Because, as Ezra's indicated, the soul of American environmentalism has been torn against itself. On the one hand, there's a kind of 1960s version of environmentalism that says, I want to save the trees that I can see. And sometimes it doesn't make contact with what I think of as a modern and realistic form of environmentalism, which says if you save every tree that you see and say, don't build there, you end up pushing development out into forests where 1,000 trees are cut down for the one that you saved. We're trying to think about environmentalism at a global scale, and that means getting out of our own way to build as much solar, wind, and other clean electricity as possible. I do want to say, though, that artificial intelligence, and especially AGI, is so much more than an energy issue. So I do want to sit a little bit in the question of what will AI do for us in the next few years? The honest answer, of course, is we have no idea. And the people working on these tools have no idea. And it's always been this fascinating technology where, weirdly, if you ask the people who are most optimistic about the technology's progress, they're most pessimistic often about the degree to which it's going to hurt humankind. Of course, that could happen. I mean, one of my big fears about artificial intelligence is that we develop a kind of super intelligent tool that becomes very, very good at encryption breaking, such that we can take down other countries' energy systems. And when I say we, I mean once we hit that frontier, like look at DeepSeek, there's something like, 4.5 months behind OpenAI? It's less than half a year until other countries have that same technology. So I'm absolutely concerned about a world where internet security is made much more frail by the existence of technologies that we can't even imagine. But I'm an optimist, and I think there is an absolutely beautiful possibility of artificial intelligence being used in healthcare in particular. Just today, the New York Times had a piece about AI in drug repurposing. So lots of people get diseases that are absolute mysteries to their doctors. And not only is there some evidence that ChatGPT is in fact better at esoteric diagnosis than human doctors, but also, one beautiful thing I think we'll be able to do with artificial intelligence is that, or with these large language models for medicine, is that the same way that ChatGPT essentially provides a kind of totalizing map of human language and finds connections between words and ideas such that when you ask it a question, it can predict the next token. seeing this perfect full map of language. There are other maps, and there are other languages. And one of them might be biology. One of them might be our cells. One of them might be our brains. And if we can build large language models that, for example, can find a way of mapping all of the various molecular effects of the drugs that we've already approved, then a doctor can look into this map, prompt an LLM, and say, I'm dealing with the following symptoms. What in the total universe of drugs that already exists might be able to cobble together a molecular response to exactly those systems? That's not particularly sci-fi. It's literally in today's New York Times. And that makes me incredibly optimistic. So there is, of course, a whole house of horrors possibility with this technology that I don't want to downplay. But I also think it's important to defend the technology first and foremost, right? Because I don't think Democrats should necessarily try to shut it down in a way that would make our entire section on clean energy for AI totally moot, right? If you thought the technology was just going to kill us, why are you building data centers to host it? I am optimistic that as difficult as it can be to summon this creature into existence, before it kills all of us, it is going to extend a lot of our lives.
I'll just build on that a little bit here as we come to an end. One of my colleagues from Vox sent me a message today that they had dug out some Slack message I sent like 8 years ago. And it said, I'm thinking about writing a piece about how liberals really need to rebuild a different relationship with technology. And he's like, whatever happened to that? And obviously it became this book. But what was behind that, and what's sort of in this book, and what I think is very relevant to the conversation about AI, is one of the inspirations for me in this project was a feeling that liberals had developed a dysfunctional relationship with technology. In part, actually, to go back to something we were talking about earlier, because I think, for very understandable reasons, they began looking at technology and seeing just corporate power. And oftentimes that was what was there, right? But particularly after 2016 and that election and the concerns about misinformation and disinformation and what we've seen with the sort of social media era of technology and the social fracture and the loneliness and the profusion of porn and like anxiety and depression, that you began to feel in the texture of modern liberalism just deep skepticism of technology. I mean, you go on Blue Sky and start talking about AI, and you'll see it really quickly, right? It's vaporware. Bullshit, Web3. And even if it's not, don't like it. There is human progress that happens through social insurance, a lot of it. There's human progress that happens through redistribution, a lot of it. But just a tremendous amount of what makes possible better lives and better politics is technology moving forward. My wife is kept alive by shots. She just is. Her liver is protected by pills that were not even available a decade ago. If we pass Medicare for all, what matters to a human being who has it, just like what matters to a human being who has Medicare right now, is whether that insurance can buy you, at any price, a cure for the disease you actually have. And sometimes it can, and right now sometimes it can't. If we are going to not just escape the worst of climate change, but have the kind of energy abundant future we want to have, and allow the rest of the world to not just catch up with, but exceed the wealth of the lives we now live, that can only be built on technological advancement. It is only possible at all because of miracles in solar and wind and battery storage, but it's not going to happen if we don't figure out green cement. It's not going to happen if we don't figure out a different approach to jet fuel. Not going to happen if we don't figure out the baseload problems. AI, we don't know what it is capable of. We just don't. My sense is a lot. Like, that's my prediction. And our attitude towards it is, I think, two things right now.
And here maybe I do agree a little bit with the corporate power folks. Our attitude towards it, one, is to think about risk. And I do think about risk. Like, I'm very influenced by the AI safety people. And attitude two is to think about profit. These companies are hoovering in venture capital, and they're going to need to pay that back. And so they need to make money. And the idea that the chatbots my children speak to will be hooked up to surveillance advertising, that these things that are to them as friends might be manipulating them for profit, chills me. We have to think with AI, not just about what it can do or how it can harm us, but what we want from it. What possibilities, what worlds it might make possible. One we know is the drug discovery world. If what AI does is accelerate the discovery of promising molecules to test, then what we need to do is open up the gates in the physical world of mice and monkeys and human beings, because testing drugs is incredibly cumbersome. And if we made it easier to do, and we could, and we've done it in some cancer drugs, which has led to huge advances in how fast we're able to iterate cancer drugs, then we could have more drugs faster and more cures faster. Right? You have to think about where the choke point is, right? If we're going to have a bigger supply of molecules, then what's next? If we are going to have advances in energy, then how do we build it? And this goes on and on and on down the line. Can we have prizes? Can the government put out billions of dollars in prizes that if AI can crack this problem that we have not cracked, that is of extraordinary value to humanity, then whoever did it gets $1 billion and the answer goes into the public domain? Can we do that? So can we give these companies a reason to shoot for something other than just profit through patents or profit through surveillance advertising? Can we put technology at the center, or at least alongside redistribution and social insurance, of social change? Can we imagine not just the 5 programs we want to expand, but the 5 technologies or technological possibilities we want to pull forward from the future into the present? That's the other half of the politics of this book. Not how do we build what we already know how to build, housing and apartment buildings and solar panels, but how do we make possible, how do we invent what we need but don't yet have? We know we can do it. We've done it on energy with the push for renewables. We've created miracles there. We've done it in drug development 1 million different times. But we did it in a way with warp speed, and then we dropped the program instead of making warp speed for 15 different things. There's a great idea floating around out there about how to do a warp speed for addiction drugs. We are just getting better and better, and drug makers, not here speaking of pharmaceutical companies, but others, although sometimes pharmaceutical companies, are getting better at addicting us. We are going to need technological solutions to that, or we are going to fail. We are already failing people. There's a bunch of ideas out there for how to accelerate that with a warp speed-like program. Why aren't we doing them? Because we don't think about these things as technology. We tell people to do personal responsibility or reduce, reuse, recycle, but often technology is the answer that works. We're seeing it right now to some degree with GLP-1s. So that's the thing that I think is a little bit under-discussed about AI. That I would like to see us do more than fear it, although maybe we should fear it. I would like us to do more than profit from it, although maybe we should profit from it. I would like to see us imagine what would be needed in addition to advances in algorithms and training sets for it to make our lives better, and then open up the choke points that stand between us and that. Because you can make a much better world than we have. This world is very different than the one 50 years ago, and the one we could have 50 years from now could be fucking awesome. So we should take that seriously and try to make it that way.
Well, I think that's a great place to close. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
awesome.
And thank you to Jerusalem. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Thank you so much to Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, and Jerusalem Demsas, and thank you all for joining us. If you have a ticket for the book signing, please stay seated and we'll call you up shortly. You can use the main lobby to exit and the lobby to your left.